What carbon projects have the biggest potential to combat net zero? What's holding back companies from funding carbon removal projects, and what are the major risks associated with them? In this episode, I speak with Simon Manley, the Director of Carbon Dioxide Removal at Sylvera, a global ratings platform for carbon projects. We discussed common issues with carbon projects, Simon's views on the upcoming SBTi Net Zero guidelines, and which project types Simon is most excited about. I started by asking Simon about his work at Sylvera.
Sylvera is a carbon data and ratings agency and platform. So we have a data platform on which there's market data, market insights, all sorts of relevant content that enables the subscribers to our platform, who are mainly corporate buyers and investors in the voluntary carbon market, the ability to navigate successfully through what is an increasingly complex sector. With the idea to ensure that they make wise and prudent investments and offtake contracts, while avoiding reputational risk, as well as ensuring that the projects that they support are actually delivering what they're promising around either carbon avoidance or carbon removal. We want to incentivize sort of real climate action, and we think that by providing data and transparency and education and awareness, that's one of the best ways of delivering that.
Yes, and of course we know that the context for this is not only the need to remove 10 gigatons a year of carbon each year that the IPCC has set out by 2050, but also the last couple of years of carbon credits in particular going through some nasty publicity, and some of them being not very effective. Obviously, there are loads of standards like isometric, Puro, Gold Standard, Vera, that regulate this stuff and provide guidelines for project developers to do their work really effectively. So what is the sort of add-on to that? Why is Sylvera important on top of those standards?
Okay, well, before we jump into that, if I may, let's not conflate the key issue around sort of carbon avoidance versus carbon removals. And so the early stages of the carbon offsetting market was characterized almost exclusively by projects that avoided the future production of CO2 into the atmosphere. And then when you refer to the 10 gigatons of CO2 that had to be removed from the atmosphere in order to keep to our 1.5 degree pathway, that speaks to the requirement to actually sort of remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which is a different suite of product types. I mean, you're absolutely right. The market has been hit by a number of scandals recently. Well, recently, the last sort of like 3 or 4 years, and those were mainly coming out of specific project types that were perhaps not being quantified, measured, monitored, and verified appropriately. And so we saw the emergence of so-called phantom credits onto the marketplace, where organizations were making purchases and making claims around activities that just didn't exist. And obviously that's no good to anybody. And so thankfully those standards have now been tightened up, and those bad actors have now sort of are not doing that anymore. So that was a very unfortunate development in the voluntary carbon market a few years ago. In terms of the question relating to your question, rather relating to methodologies, so Sylvera, we've developed assessment frameworks for specific project types, which we use to assess the quality and the integrity of specific projects, and we do it from the project up level. But those are different to methodologies. These are not sorts of methodologies that you might see on Vera or Isometric or Puro, where it is basically mainly a sort of science-led quantification approach and a set of eligibility sort of thresholds that are required in order for those registries to feel comfortable issuing credits. And so it's those projects that have issued credits through or have had their projects verified through those registries that have developed methodologies. It's those projects that we assess. but we don't have our own carbon quantification methodologies
Yes.
for
Maybe
issue credit.
could you possibly give us an example, like say for enhanced rock weathering, for example, a carbon
Mhm.
removal project?
Mhm.
What might you be adding on to an existing methodology?
Sure. So it might be better. I mean, we can talk about different project types. So for example, with DACCS, so we have looked at a number of the different project developers that have that they're out there in the marketplace at the moment who are claiming some very high quality credits and therefore sort of aspects of their sort of carbon accounting and the other sort of eligibility criteria. And we do certainly have a look at the methodology that they're using to issue credits, but we also look in sort of forensic detail at all of the different aspects that make up what would be a quality or an integrity assessment of their particular their CDR claim. So that covers carbon accounting. So not only the gross CDR claim, but also how are they properly sort of accounting for the project emissions that mainly sort of sit within the LCA. We look at durability, we look at additionality, and we also look at co-benefits. And those four things contribute to an overall assessment and a score akin to the type of rating that you might see in the financial services market. And it's that rating that project developers and investors and buyers find extremely useful as a marker of quality and integrity around that individual project. And so the methodology is the methodology that the project is using to generate credit should not be seen as the sort of the final destination in terms of quality. It is a method to quantify in our case, and we're talking about carbon removal, right? So it's a method to quantify carbon removal, but it is uh, um, they're kind of time stamped in as much as, especially in the CDR market where things are evolving so fast, they contain the best available science at the time of their publication, and that doesn't always sort of stay the same. So it's super important that that companies like Sylvera stay on top of these developments and evolutions and ensure that the methodologies being used are the as up to date as possible, and also the carbon accounting requirements that sit within them are also being properly utilized by the actual project developer.
Yes. I'd like to sort of get a sense as if there are obviously your the whole sort of purpose of Sylvera is to sort of keep the bar as high as possible and restore trust to funding for carbon projects. Um, are there projects then that you uh, see to be very high risk? And if so, what would those be? Obviously, you discussed the distinction between avoidance and removal credits. Removal credits tend to be seen um, as having more credibility to them. Um, what's your sort of overview of that?
What do you mean by that? Removals credits have more credibility?
Well, for example, lots of the scandals were around reforestation credits,
Mm.
credits funding, rainforest protection, um, which is an avoidance credit, not removing additional carbon. Um, are there some project types that you would just rule out, for example, as too risky, for example?
The there's so I'm the director of CDR for Sylvera, and so I see the world through very much a carbon removal lens. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk about any avoidance project types, but from a CDR perspective,
Hmm.
um, I think the most useful way to look at it is the people use technology readiness levels. The folks at Frontier use a verification confidence level kind of scale, which speaks to the maturity of the project types that are being considered for implementation and verification. And so if you have a look at the verification confidence levels, for example, you'll see projects like BECCS and DACCS at very much at the sort of the high confidence level.
Mm.
And this is because the project types have been around for a while. They're considered to be sort of meterable. In other words, you can kind of see the CO2 being removed and stored from the atmosphere, and it's considered to be pretty safe when it comes to sort of potential risk of reversal. And the science that underpins those project types is well established and proven.
Yeah, so that's
That is,
BECCS,
that is
bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and then DACCS, direct air carbon capture and storage. Would
correct. Yeah.
and would how about projects such as biochar, which I've had on the podcast before, and enhanced rock weathering? Where do they
Yeah.
sort of sit for
So,
you?
the two that we mentioned, DAX and BEX, are at sort of one end of the scale, and then that
Mm,
scale sort of goes in sort of direction towards sort of the lowest level of confidence. And so,
mm,
I think sort of biochar sits almost next to BEX and DAX, with ERW following closely behind. And then right at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of the lowest level of confidence, that doesn't necessarily mean, or you've got projects like perhaps like marine CDR. And that doesn't mean that marine CDR is a project that carries sort of huge amounts of risk and will do forever. It just means that the project type is relatively immature, and the science that underpins the quantification approach that might then get embedded into a methodology is not established and proven to a point where the
mm,
registries are confident enough to build it into methodologies. I mean, in the case of marine CDR, there are a few methodologies that have emerged recently. I know Isometric and Puro have one for different sort of flavors of marine CDR. So
mm,
that is happening now. And I think we will see the confidence levels around that particular project type go up over time,
mm.
and then it will move its way across the scale to something of high confidence. And so, the risk associated with the projects or project types is really characterized by the relative maturity of the project type itself, and it's a project type is never really going to get a methodology sort of written for it, and therefore the ability to generate credits if the sort of just the project type is just too risky by its very nature, as opposed to the maturity level.
Sure, sure. Are there any project types that you think this has a huge amount of potential, but it's sort of being overlooked slightly and really could do with more investment and more attention, or perhaps more risks taken on it, as it were, from a funding perspective?
I mean, we sort of live and die by de-risking projects through assessing them for not only quality and integrity, but also their delivery and execution risk. And so I wouldn't encourage anyone to take more risk, certainly when it comes to
Mm,
these types of projects. However, obviously, early projects do need support, and they do need investment to get them sort of to the point that they're methodology ready, and to the point that they are sort of super well established in the marketplace. The project type that I am most excited about at the moment, and again, this is relatively UK and European focused, but it's energy from waste, as with carbon capture and storage as a subset of BECCS. And the reason I like that so much is because it's sort of the feedstock that's being used it sits completely in the waste stream. And so while that makes the LCA quite complicated in terms of separating out the sort of the sort of origin emissions from there's the biogenic component and there's a fossil-based component, so it's mixed sort of biomass and plastics. But and then the burning of the waste itself obviously generates renewable heat, and then as long as the carbon capture and storage component works correctly, then the carbon component can then be, or the biogenic carbon rather, can then be sort of processed and stored for the long term in sort of saline aquifers in the North Sea, for example. And in the UK alone, I think we've got something like 60 energy from waste incineration plants. And so if we were to, so that infrastructure already exists. If we were to install CCS technology or equipment onto all of those, the potential sort of carbon saving is absolutely massive into the millions. And I think it could make a sort of a huge difference. One of the key challenges is not necessarily the incineration plants themselves, but the network of pipes that we would need to get the carbon to a place where it can be stored. However, as a project type, it has huge potential, and we're very excited about it.
Interesting. I wanted to just ask briefly about the permanence side of things. Obviously, that's been one of the issues with projects is sometimes they lack that permanence when the carbon dioxide is released. Obviously, it stays in the atmosphere for many decades. Um, Project types are usually seen as better when they store carbon for a long time. Do you have any thoughts on how long is enough, I suppose, and do you have a rule of thumb on that, or what's your view on that?
So on the issue of durability, I mean, it's long been debated as to whether things that have sort of sub 100 years is that okay? Soil organic carbon, for example,
Mm.
or is that sort of not worth implementing? What happens if it's just 100 years and a bit? Sort of afforestation, for example, is that acceptable? And then you'll speak to the CDR purists who don't want to get out of bed until it's 1,000 years plus durability. And so
Right.
I think everything has a place, and I don't think we can necessarily. We need to do it all now, right? Because such is the state of the climate crisis. However, it needs to be organized in a way that is not down to the loudest voice in the room or a matter of opinion, which could be quite debilitating, but more, I mean, I particularly like the like for like principle. However, I don't think the world is ready for it yet because were it to be implemented tomorrow, we would suddenly have a supply crunch and there would nowhere near be enough durable CDR credits to match the CO2 emissions that are still going into the atmosphere.
Mhm.
And so the principles which I think are sort of most relevant at the moment are those laid down by the Oxford offsetting principles, where we see this gradual transition towards durable CDR as organizations hit their sort of net zero targets, be that anywhere between 2030 and 2050. And so that sees a role for both NBS and durable CDR over that time period. And so and therefore you're combining project types which offer durability of anywhere between 100 to 1,000 years plus.
Mm, mm, mm. I'd love to switch to the sort of business side of this industry, if I may. I mean, what do you see as the primary driver from a business perspective of companies looking to fund carbon removal projects? Because obviously, offsetting claims have become a little bit sometimes of a dirty word to some people. Um, yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that. What what is the key motivation for companies to fund carbon removal?
As companies approach their net zero targets, they're going to need to utilize removal credits in order to achieve a true net zero. Some organizations have a net zero target of 2030, which is, less than 5 years away, and therefore need to be getting themselves organized, right now in order to enable themselves to hit net zero upon that date. Most organizations have a sort of longer timeline, 2040 or 2050. And so that combined with what's currently laid down in the available guidelines, SBTi principally, although that is being changed currently, kind of makes the purchase and utilization of carbon removals as a bit of a tomorrow problem. And I think that is a massive mistake. And we're all going to have a nasty shock at the point that people want to actually access and utilize removal credits at that point, at the sort of when organizations hit their net zero deadlines. And that's because there's just not going to be the supply. And also
Mm,
organizations need to kind of familiarize themselves with the whole sort of how to get themselves organized around utilizing carbon removal credits to address their residual or difficult to abate emissions. And that requires them to understand the different project types, the procurement process, how to support these projects. And
yes.
frankly, if you just kind of get away from net zero and sort of the actual sort of business case, then it is also super important that that organizations get involved in this now, because these project types and project developers need to scale up, and they need to scale up as soon as possible in order that they can deliver the credits. 10 billion tons a year by 2050.
Yeah,
You don't have to look
massive.
very far to find out that we are absolutely nowhere near that right now. And so the scale up required of this sector is just absolutely enormous, and that's not going to happen if companies sit on their hands until 2049 and don't try and support that marketplace. You've asked about, what does the business case look like now? I mean, it's difficult, right? So if you're sitting in the sustainability team of a large organization and looking for, let's say, budget from the finance director to purchase credits, it's a tricky sell. You know, is it? Are we bound to do this legally? Do we have to do it by law? No. Are there lots of other organizations within our peer group doing it? No. Does it carry high reputational risk? Yes. Is it quite expensive? Yeah, really expensive. And so, if I was a finance director with perhaps looking at the world through a financial rather than a climate change lens, I would probably tell that team to come back when they've got better answers to those questions.
Really? Well, yeah, and I was going to say, to add to that list, of course, I often hear from our clients, it's well, we could spend that money on decarbonizing. Um, and that's obviously the bulk of emissions need to be removed internally as opposed to externally through through buying removals. Do you sort of have a view on, or advice that you give to companies um, on that, on like when they should start that addressing of residuals?
Yeah, I mean, I completely buy into the kind of strategy behind this, which is you have to decarbonize as much as possible before considering the use of removal credits for addressing your residual emissions. And those guidelines are laid down by most credible organizations, including SBTi and soon to be ISO in their net zero guidelines. So that is absolutely what organizations should be doing. However, that doesn't, like we've just said, doesn't mean you do nothing around removals now. You are, if you look at the guidelines, you are being actively encouraged to participate in beyond value chain mitigation and the use of offset credits while you're on your decarbonisation journey, and to have a clear understanding of what your demand for removals is going to look like when you get to your net zero deadline now. Will give you,
Mm,
the sufficient run up, and you need to plan for it operationally. You need to plan from a budget perspective, and you need to plan from your in terms of your decarbonisation plans. So again, for me, waiting until later is just not an option. You're gonna get it wrong.
mm. Obviously, there is a bit of a sort of less of an incentive now that companies don't tend to use the sort of carbon neutral language as much. That they don't feel that they need to, or that sort of connected to the lack of um, the pressure perhaps to fund these sorts of projects. Do you have a view on companies making offsetting claims themselves?
Well, yeah, as long as it's done right, I think it's fine. I mean, the whole carbon neutral thing, I think, has probably sort of had its time. I think it's now illegal to even use carbon neutral claims for certainly for products in Europe. The and so the yeah, I think it's the VCMI is probably the best organization to look to for guidance around how to make claims associated with the purchase and utilization of carbon offset credits, and that includes both avoidance and removals. So as long as you follow those, I think those claims are very good. I think that guidance rather is very good.
Mm,
So where you to follow what's been laid down by the VCMI, I think you're probably in safe territory.
mm,
But no, I think organizations that sort of get it wrong, either on purpose or by accident, it's awful. And that, yeah, they should be hauled across the coals.
mm. Do you have any views on the latest SBTi standard on net zero that's just come out recently, where they've slightly altered their scope 3 requirements at all?
Well, they have issued a draft, haven't they, for consultation?
Yeah.
And I think it's an improvement on the previous draft in as much as it does now encourage organizations to get involved with, with removals now rather than later. So, kind of taking away that it's a tomorrow problem
Mm,
factor. But it comes back to the theme which we talking about a lot, which is it doesn't really go far enough.
mm,
So it really only covers sort of scope one, and it says that you can kind of accumulate credit purchase and utilization up to your overall total as you approach your sort of net zero deadline. And so what that means is if you were to follow those guidelines to the letter, it just means that organizations are not going to accelerate or enable the scale up that it will be required to maintain a 1.5 or a 2 degree pathway. So, organizations, if the SBTi guidelines stay as they are in their current form in the draft, then organizations are going to have to go over and above that in order to stick to where we need to get to. So it's improved, but it isn't enough.
interesting. Thank you. I'd just like to sort of,
But it is still in draft, so I can't
it
say,
is in draft. Yes.
let's see what
Of
that
course,
final
open for
version looks
consultation.
like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, we're getting to the end, but I'd love to just sort of circle back to the lighter topic of your work previously was in um, sort of project development, as I understand it, in sort of biochar and enhanced rock weathering. Obviously, you've moved into this sort of standards um, field. I just wondered what what made you make that move? Why did you decide to move into quite a little bit of a different area in this space?
I enjoyed working as a project developer, and the main motivation was I wanted to have a role that allowed me to have a much broader scope from a project type perspective than I had. As you know, I worked for a long time in biochar, about 11 years, and then sort of 4 years in enhanced rock weathering. And I'm lucky enough that I've got sort of deep knowledge of those project types, and those are now two project types that are of significant interest to the CDR community. However, I am a strong believer in, we have to be doing it all at once right now, right?
Mm.
And that involves a far broader scope or range of project types, including BECS and DACCS. ERW and biochar, of course, and then the less mature project types, such as we talked about marine CDR, and there are others as well. And so to have the opportunity to work in some capacity across that whole spectrum was of particular interest to me. So I took the opportunity when it came.
Yeah. And do you see Sylvera as being that sort of beacon of guidance when it comes to these very fast changing landscape of um, carbon removal technologies going ahead? What's the sort of how much do you expect it to scale? I suppose is what I'm this industry, I suppose is what I'm asking.
Which industry? The CDR
Carbon removal, yeah.
carbon removal. How much do I expect it to scale?
Yeah, and thereby sort of how much of a role do you expect Sylvera to play in that?
The CDR industry has to scale in order for us not to sort of suffer the worst effects of the climate crisis, right?
Mm,
That requires at the moment, everyone talks about basically the lack of sort of demand in the marketplace. We're very lucky to have a few early adopter um, organizations making massive purchases. Obviously Microsoft is by far the sort of the most significant massive purchases of CDR credits currently, but we have to increase that buyer pool to include the full spectrum of organizations that are currently chasing net zero targets. And we're not going to get to where we need to if we are not successful in that mission. And that is what Sylvera is sort of setting out to do, to incentivize sort of real climate action. And within sort of my world in the CDR space, success looks like bringing more and more organizations, so corporate buyers and investors, into the CDR sector, um, confident and comfortable enough around what they're doing, the data that underpins it, and what they can claim off the back of it. And so I think we will just play a more and more significant role. I hope we will anyway, in sort of achieving that objective.
Well, thank you, Simon. It's been really interesting to speak to you as a sort of more unbiased party overseeing these different types of projects, because I've spoken to different people in previous episodes, in particular project types. So thank you so much for your time and telling us all about Sylvera.
Not at all. You're welcome.